A stranger told me a sick little boy might be my nephew. I called my father expecting him to laugh. Instead, he whispered, "You were never supposed to know." By morning, I knew about the son he'd hidden for decades and exactly whose side I was taking. I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store when the call came. I almost ignored it. Unknown number. Middle of the afternoon. I figured it was spam, but I was waiting for a call back about an appointment, so I answered. "Is this Tracy?" "Yes." The man introduced himself as a private investigator and asked whether Douglas was my father. That immediately put me on edge. "Why?" "I'm helping someone locate members of his biological family." I frowned. "I think you have the wrong person. My father has 3 children. There was a short pause. "I understand why you would think that." Something about those words made my stomach tighten. Then he said a name I had never heard before. Victor. 32 years old. For years older than me. And according to everything he had confirmed, Victor and I shared the same father. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought it had to be a scam. I looked through my windshield at people pushing carts toward their cars. A woman was loading groceries into her trunk. Someone was arguing over a parking space. Everything around me looked completely ordinary. Meanwhile, a stranger had just told me I had an older brother. "No," I said. "That's impossible." The investigator calmly confirmed a few details about my father. Then my mother. Then my younger brothers. Chad and Brian. He knew enough that I stopped believing he had randomly picked my number. I asked the obvious question. "Why is this man trying to find us?" The investigator's voice softened. "His son is seriously ill." That changed everything. Victor had a young son named Joel. Joel needed a bone marrow transplant. Victor had already contacted my father. Dad had been tested and wasn't a suitable donor. Victor wanted to know whether there were other biological relatives willing to be tested. I barely heard anything after that. One detail had caught in my mind. My father was tested? Yes. So my dad knows who Victor is? Yes. How long has he known? The investigator hesitated. As far as I understand, since before Victor was born. I ended the call a few minutes later. Then I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, trying to make the information fit into the life I knew. It didn't. My father had 3 children. Me, Chad, Brian. That had always been one of those facts so basic I had never questioned it. Then I called Dad. He answered normally. "Hey, Trace." For half a second, I nearly convinced myself the whole thing was a misunderstanding. So I asked him, "Who is Victor?" Silence. Not confusion. Not Victor who. Silence. "Dad." His voice changed. "How did you hear that name?" And just like that, I knew. A man called me. Dad muttered something under his breath. Then he said quietly, "You were never supposed to know." I gripped the steering wheel. "What does that mean?" "Tracy, don't do this over the phone." "Do I have a brother?" "It's complicated." That isn't an answer. Another pause. Then he said, "Yes." My throat went dry. "How old is he?" 32. I didn't need a calculator. My parents were already married when Victor was born. I had seen their wedding photographs my entire life. I knew the timeline. "You cheated on Mom." "It happened a very long time ago." "That isn't what I asked." "Yes." "Does Mom know?" "No." That answer hurt worse than I expected. My mother had spent more than 3 decades married to this man. She thought she knew the major events of their life together. Dad knew she didn't even know how many children he had. I asked whether Victor's mother knew Dad was married. He said yes. I asked whether Victor knew about us. Again, yes. That made me angry in a way I wasn't ready for. So he knew he had siblings? Yes. But we weren't allowed to know about him? Dad sighed. His mother and I agreed it was better to keep the family separate. Better for who? He didn't answer. I asked whether Dad had been involved in Victor's childhood. Not really. What does that mean? I helped financially. For how long? Years. And Mom never knew? No. That opened an entirely different wound. Dad wasn't describing some second household where he secretly spent weekends playing father. He hadn't raised Victor. He hadn't gone to school events or birthdays. He had simply sent money over the years while keeping the reason hidden from his wife. How many times have you actually seen him? Twice. I thought I had misunderstood. Twice in 32 years? Yes. The first time was when Victor was in college. Victor had wanted to meet his biological father. Dad met him briefly. Then they went back to barely having a relationship. The second time happened after Joel became sick. Victor contacted Dad because doctors were looking for a donor. Dad agreed to be tested. He wasn't compatible. Then Victor asked about Dad's other biological children. Us. What did you tell him? I asked. Dad hesitated. I told him not to involve you. I sat completely still. His son needs a transplant. I know. And he asked if his half-siblings might be willing to get tested. There are registries. There are other options. That wasn't my question. I didn't want this tearing the family apart. I almost laughed. You didn't want what tearing the family apart? Victor existing? You know what I mean. No, Dad. I don't. He exhaled sharply. The affair happened over 30 years ago. The affair did. The lie didn't. He went quiet. I asked him one final question. If Victor hadn't found us, were you ever going to tell us? Dad said no. At least he was honest about that. I hung up. Then I called Chad. I need you and Brian to meet me. His tone changed immediately. Is Mom okay? I don't know. What happened? I'll tell you when we're together. Less than an hour later, the three of us were sitting around my kitchen table. Chad was 26. Brian was 24. Both knew something serious had happened. Brian finally said, "You're freaking me out." So I told them. We have an older brother. Chad stared at me. What? Dad has another son. Brian gave a nervous laugh. Then he realized I wasn't joking. How old? 32. Chad's expression changed immediately. Dad and Mom were married. Yes. Neither of them spoke. Then Brian asked, "Does Dad know?" He's known the whole time. That landed harder. If Dad had just discovered the truth too, maybe we could have faced it together. But this wasn't something that had happened to Dad. It was something Dad had hidden. I told them Victor's name. Then I told them about Joel. The anger in the room shifted. There was suddenly something more urgent than our father's betrayal. A little boy we had never met was sick. And whether we had known about him or not, he was our nephew. Chad immediately said, "I'll get tested." Brian nodded. Me too. I wanted to say the same thing. I couldn't. Years earlier, I had been treated for cancer. I was doing well now, but my medical history made me ineligible to donate bone marrow. I had spent years being grateful that chapter of my life was behind me. Now, for the first time in a long time, I resented it. There was a child in my family who might need something I couldn't even offer. Brian saw my face. You would if you could. I know. Chad leaned forward. Then that's all you need to know. I nodded. The harder problem was Mom. None of us believed she should hear this from anyone except us and Dad. Dad wanted time. We didn't give him much. The next evening, the five of us sat in my parents' living room. Mom knew immediately that something was wrong. She kept looking from me to Chad to Brian. Then at Dad. What happened? Dad started carefully. There's something from a long time ago that I need to tell you. Mom folded her arms. What? I made a mistake early in our marriage. Her face changed. What kind of mistake? Dad looked down. I was unfaithful. Mom stared at him. When? He told her. She did the math. We were married. Yes. Her voice got quieter. We were already married. Dad kept saying it happened once. One mistake. One indiscretion. He seemed obsessed with that detail, as if limiting the affair to one encounter limited everything that followed. Mom asked, "Is there anything else?" Dad hesitated. That hesitation told her there was. She looked at me. I hated that moment. I didn't want to be involved in telling my mother that the man she had trusted for more than 30 years had another child. But there was no way around it anymore. I said, there was a pregnancy. Mom's eyes snapped back to Dad. What? Dad swallowed. She had a son. Mom stared at him. How old? 32. Her face went blank. Not angry. Not yet. Just blank. You have had another son for 32 years? Dad started explaining the arrangement with Victor's mother. Mom cut him off. You have a son. I provided for him. You have a son. Anita. And you never told me. Dad said he hadn't been part of Victor's life. That didn't help. Mom looked at him in disbelief. So you abandoned him too? I didn't abandon him. I sent support. Did you raise him? No. Did you go to his birthdays? No. School events? No. Did you know his friends? Dad looked irritated. That isn't fair. Mom actually laughed. It was one sharp sound. Fair. Dad went quiet. Then she asked, why are you telling me now? I answered before Dad could reshape the story. Victor has a son. Mom looked at me. His name is Joel. He's sick. Her anger disappeared for a moment. What's wrong with him? He needs a bone marrow transplant. Mom put a hand over her mouth. I explained that Dad had already been tested. He wasn't a suitable donor. Other donor options were being explored, but Victor wanted to know whether more biological relatives might be willing to be tested. Then Dad said he had no right to hire someone and drag everyone into this. Mom slowly turned toward him. What? Dad realized what he had said. He should have respected boundaries. His child is sick. I know. And he asked about his biological family. Yes. And you told him not to contact our children. Dad didn't answer. Mom looked at me. Is that true? Yes. That was the moment she started crying. Not when she learned Dad had cheated. Not even when she learned Victor existed. It was when she realized Dad had been given another opportunity to tell the truth in the present and had still chosen secrecy. Mom stood up and walked upstairs. Dad followed her. She told him not to. 20 minutes later, she came back carrying a suitcase. Dad stepped toward her. Anita, please. She shook her head. I don't know who I'm talking to right now. Then she left. Mom stayed with my grandmother for several weeks. During that time, the story spread through the extended family. I hated that almost as much as everything else. Some people called because they were genuinely worried about Mom. Others wanted entertainment. Who was Victor's mother? Was Dad still in contact with her? How much money had he sent? Were there more children? Would Mom divorce him? People took the worst week of my mother's life and turned it into gossip. I stopped answering certain relatives entirely. The only part of the situation that actually mattered urgently was Joel. Chad and Brian went through donor testing. My uncle volunteered. Several cousins did too. Nobody assumed being related guaranteed anything. We simply wanted to widen the search in every reasonable way we could. Results started coming back. No match. Then another. No match. Each time, I told myself not to panic. Joel's doctors had other avenues. There was a broader donor search. But knowing that didn't make the waiting easier. For almost a week, I avoided calling Victor. I knew that wasn't fair. Logically, I understood he had done nothing wrong. He hadn't cheated on my mother. He hadn't hidden himself. He hadn't chosen to be born into this mess. But every time I heard his name, I pictured my mother crying. Eventually, I realized that if I kept treating Victor like the cause of our pain, I was doing exactly what Dad had done. Making Victor responsible for a secret he didn't create. So I called him. He answered after 2 rings. Hello. Is this Victor? Yes. This is Tracy. Silence. Then he said, I know. Neither of us seemed to know how to begin. So I started with Joel. How's your son? His voice softened immediately. Still fighting. I'm sorry. Thank you. Another pause. Then Victor said, I'm sorry about your mom. That made something inside me snap into place. You don't need to apologize for that. I knew contacting you could cause problems. Your son needs help. I know. What were you supposed to do? Protect Dad's secret instead? Victor was quiet. Then he said, I didn't contact you to expose him. I know. I'm not looking for money. I know. I don't want anything from your family. I took a breath. You're trying to save your kid. I understand that. For the first time since the call started, Victor sounded relieved. He explained that he had known for years that Dad had another family. He knew there were 3 younger children. He knew our first names. He knew roughly how old we were. But when he met Dad in college, Dad made it clear we had no idea Victor existed and that contacting us would cause problems. Victor stayed away. Not because he never wondered about us. Because he understood the message. Dad wanted the 2 parts of his life kept separate. Then Joel became sick. Victor contacted Dad again. After Dad wasn't a suitable donor, Victor asked whether we could be told. Dad said no. Victor listened for a while. Then his fear for his son became bigger than his fear of upsetting Dad. That was why he hired someone to find us. I wish we had met differently, Victor said. So do I. We talked for almost an hour. Mostly about Joel. A little about Brenda, Victor's wife. A little about our brothers. Very little about Dad. Before we hung up, Victor said something that stayed with me. I spent a long time wondering what you were like. That hurt. Because I had never spent a single second wondering about him. I hadn't been given the chance. After that, Chad and Brian started talking to Victor too. At first, everything was awkward. There was no instant sibling bond. No dramatic reunion where we hugged and suddenly made up for 32 missing years. We were strangers who happened to share DNA. So we started with ordinary conversations. Work was barely mentioned because it didn't matter. We talked about movies, food, music, family habits. The weirdest part was discovering similarities. Victor and Brian both tapped their fingers against tables when they were thinking. Victor raised one eyebrow exactly like Dad when he was skeptical. Sometimes he used the same phrases Dad used. It was strange seeing pieces of my family in someone I had known for only weeks. Meanwhile, the donor search continued. My relatives who were tested weren't suitable matches. Then my cousin Seth got involved. His longtime girlfriend Penny had been around our family long enough to know what was happening. Seth had volunteered to be tested. Penny asked how she could join the donor search herself. She wasn't related to Joel. No one expected anything. She simply wanted to help. Then she received follow-up contact. More testing followed. One evening, Seth called me. His voice sounded strange. "Are you sitting down?" My heart immediately jumped. What happened? Penny might be compatible. I thought I had misunderstood. With Joel? Yes. But she isn't related to him. I know. More testing confirmed it. Penny was a suitable donor. Of all the people connected to our family, the person who might give Joel the chance everyone had been hoping for had no biological connection to him at all. When I called Victor, he could barely speak. Brenda was crying in the background. I cried too. Penny handled the whole thing more calmly than the rest of us. When I thanked her, she looked uncomfortable. "You don't have to keep doing that." "Yes, I do." "No. If I can help him, I'm doing it." "Are you scared?" She thought about it. A little. I appreciated that answer more than some grand statement about bravery. She wasn't pretending the process was nothing. She simply believed helping Joel was worth doing even if she was nervous. The transplant went ahead. Then came more waiting. Because of my own medical history, I knew better than to treat the transplant like a guaranteed happy ending. There were appointments, precautions, good updates, then days when everyone worried again. Every time Victor called, my stomach tightened until I heard his voice. But slowly, the news improved. Joel was responding well. Then he started recovering. Then his energy began coming back. The first time I met him, I expected some huge emotional moment. Instead, he looked at me like I was just another strange adult who had suddenly appeared in his life. Which was fair. I didn't force anything. I sat near him while he played a video game. After a while, he handed me a controller. "Do you know how to play?" "Probably badly." He gave me a look. "You can be on my team anyway." That was it. That was the beginning. Later, I sat in my car and cried. Not because anything bad had happened. Because I kept thinking about how close we had come to never knowing this child. If Joel hadn't become sick, Victor probably would have stayed away. Dad had spent decades making it clear that silence was the condition for keeping the peace. That realization changed the way I saw my father. The affair mattered. The financial secrecy mattered. But what damaged my relationship with him most happened after Joel became ill. Dad had been given one more chance to do the right thing. He could have gathered us together himself. He could have told Mom the truth. He could have admitted what he had done and said, "There is a child who needs help." Instead, he tried to keep the secret intact. I confronted him about that months later. He was still furious Victor had contacted us. He invaded our privacy. His son was sick. There were other donor options. And he was pursuing them. Dad shook his head. "He didn't have to bring this into your mother's life." I stared at him. "You brought it into Mom's life 32 years ago. She just didn't know." "That's not fair." "You keep saying that. Because none of you understand what this has cost me." I almost couldn't believe it. "What it cost you?" "I carried this for decades." "You knew about it for decades." He stopped. "You had time to get used to the truth," I said. "Mom didn't." Victor had to grow up with it. We didn't even know there was a truth to get used to. Dad looked away. Then he said what he had said from the beginning. "The past is the past." I shook my head. "Not when you're still protecting it in the present." That was the last serious conversation we had for a long time. Mom eventually filed for divorce. Dad seemed genuinely shocked. He kept saying their marriage had lasted more than 3 decades. He kept asking how one mistake could erase everything they had built. Mom gave him the clearest answer. "For you, it happened decades ago. For me, It happened when I found out. And even that wasn't the entire problem. The affair might have been one event. Everything afterward had required decisions. Keeping Victor secret. Sending money without telling Mom what it was for. Allowing Victor to grow up without meaningful involvement from him. Meeting his own son only twice. Then trying to keep Victor away from us when Joel became ill. Mom stopped believing Dad when he said there had never been another affair. Maybe he was telling the truth. I genuinely don't know. Neither did she. That was the damage. Once someone proves they can hide something that enormous for more than 30 years, their reassurance doesn't carry the same weight. The divorce itself wasn't some dramatic courtroom war. There was no secret mansion. No hidden fortune. No second household Mom discovered. They had financial matters to sort through, and the years of support Dad had quietly sent became part of understanding what had happened. But money wasn't the reason Mom left. Trust was. One evening, Dad again told her the affair had happened once. Mom replied, maybe the affair did. Keeping it from me happened every day afterward. There wasn't much left to argue about after that. My relationship with Victor developed slowly. That made it feel more real. Sometimes we talked easily. Sometimes we accidentally stepped into things neither of us knew how to handle. Once, I complained about Dad being overprotective when I learned to drive. Victor got quiet. I immediately regretted saying it. I'm sorry. He looked confused. For what? For complaining about Dad doing too much when I didn't finish. Victor understood. He shook his head. Don't rewrite your childhood for me. I looked at him. You're allowed to have your memories. Even annoying ones. Then he smiled slightly. He was your dad. That sentence hurt. Because Victor was his son too. Another time, Victor admitted that when he was younger, he sometimes wondered whether we looked like him. Whether we acted like him. Whether we would have liked each other. He never knew. Dad had made that decision for all four of us. My mother took longer to meet Victor. She never blamed him. But knowing that intellectually and being ready to sit across from him were different things. Victor understood that. He never pushed. Months later, Mom asked if he would meet her for coffee. I offered to go with her. She said no. I need to do this myself. They were gone for almost 2 hours. When Mom came home, her eyes were swollen. I immediately worried. What happened? Nothing bad. She sat at my kitchen table. He apologized to me. For what? For what happened to my marriage. I felt angry. He shouldn't have. I told him that. Mom wiped her eyes. He said he worried I would hate him. She looked down. How could I hate him? He was the child in all of this. After that, something shifted. Mom started asking about Joel more. Then Brenda. Eventually, she agreed to have dinner with everyone. The first big family dinner with Victor there was painfully awkward. Everyone was trying too hard. Chad kept offering people drinks. Brian made jokes that weren't funny. Seth and Penny were trying to act normal. Mom and Victor were polite in that careful way people are when they're afraid one wrong sentence might ruin the evening. Then Joel knocked a plate off the table. It shattered on the floor. He froze. Everyone else froze too. And Mom started laughing. Not at Joel. At us. At how seriously every adult in the room had been behaving, only for a kid to break the tension with a plate. Victor started laughing. Then Brenda. Then me. Within seconds, almost everyone was laughing. Mom helped Joel get another plate. Dinner became easier after that. Not perfect. Just human. Dad wasn't invited. He hated that. He accused us of letting Victor divide the family. Brian finally told him, Victor didn't create the problem. He just stopped helping you hide it. Dad didn't have much to say after that. As time passed, my contact with Dad became less frequent. The complicated part was that I couldn't simply rewrite him into a monster. He had been a good father to me in many ways. When I had cancer, he showed up. He sat beside me during appointments. He brought food when I could barely eat. He made terrible jokes because he knew I was scared. Those memories were real. And that made what happened with Victor harder to understand. One day Dad said, "You act like I was a horrible father." I never said that. You barely speak to me. I thought carefully before answering. You were a good father to me. His face softened. Then I continued. That's why I have such a hard time understanding Victor. Dad frowned. What does that mean? You knew how to show up. He looked away. You knew how to be a dad. You did it for me, Chad, and Brian. So this wasn't because you didn't know how. He didn't answer. Then he said, "There's more to the story than you understand." Then tell me. He never gave me anything that changed the basic facts. There were explanations about what had seemed best at the time. About agreements. About avoiding damage. But Victor had still grown up largely without him. And Mom had still spent decades living inside a version of her marriage that wasn't complete. 3 years have passed since that first phone call. Joel is doing well. That is the part of the story I care about most. He has energy now. He complains when people fuss over him. He sends me ridiculous videos and gets annoyed if I don't respond quickly enough. If you met him now without knowing the story, you would never guess how much fear surrounded his name when I first heard it. Penny and Seth are engaged. Penny still hates when anyone makes a big deal about what she did. Joel doesn't care. He thinks she's amazing. So do the rest of us. Victor and Brenda are part of our family now. Not because biology instantly made us close. Because we kept showing up. Calls. Dinners. Birthdays. Holidays. Ordinary weekends. Those ordinary moments did more to make Victor my brother than any DNA result ever could. I no longer introduce him in my head as Dad's secret son. He's just my older brother. Sometimes that still feels strange. There are 32 years between us that we can't recover. We'll never have childhood stories together. I'll never remember him teasing me when I was 10 or arguing with Chad over a toy. Those years are gone. But the years ahead of us aren't. Mom lives on her own now. The adjustment was difficult. For most of her adult life, she had built routines around a marriage. Then suddenly, every decision belonged to her. At first, she hated the quiet. Then she started filling it. She bought furniture Dad never would have chosen. She painted a wall a color he always disliked. She started taking occasional trips with her sister. Small things. But I watched those small things become evidence that she was building a life instead of waiting for her old one to come back. She still has bad days. Sometimes an anniversary comes around. Sometimes an old photograph catches her off guard. Sometimes she wonders whether the good parts of her marriage were real. I tell her they were real to her. Her love was real. Her commitment was real. Her memories belonged to her. Dad's dishonesty doesn't get to erase the sincerity with which she lived those years. But it also doesn't obligate her to spend the rest of her life pretending she still trusts him. Dad is mostly outside the family now. Chad speaks to him occasionally. Brian rarely does. I answer some of his calls. Mom communicates with him only when necessary. There was no elaborate revenge. No public humiliation. No scheme to destroy him. We didn't need one. We simply stopped arranging our lives around protecting his secret. We welcomed Victor. We got to know Brenda. We loved Joel. Mom left a marriage she could no longer trust. Dad sees those things as punishment. I see them as choices he no longer had the power to control. Sometimes I still think about the phone call that started everything. Not the affair. Not the divorce. The call. Because if Joel had never become sick, I'm almost certain I would still know none of this. Victor probably would have stayed away. Dad would have kept quiet. I would still believe I was his oldest child. Chad and Brian would have no idea they had another brother. And Joel could have grown up only a few hours away from relatives who didn't know his name. I would erase Joel's illness instantly if I could. But I would never erase Victor from our lives. Dad spent more than 30 years keeping two parts of his family separate. In the end, almost everyone he kept apart chose to know each other. Victor gained siblings. Joel gained an aunt, 2 uncles, cousins, and grandparents he never expected. Mom eventually found peace outside the marriage. And Dad became the person standing furthest away from the family he claimed he was trying to protect. I don't celebrate that. He is still my father. Part of me will probably always love the man who sat beside me when I was sick. But loving him doesn't require pretending his choices didn't hurt people. Dad still believes a mistake from decades ago shouldn't have cost him his marriage and damaged his relationships with his children. Maybe some people would agree. Maybe they would say Mom should have forgiven him because the affair was so old. Maybe they would say Victor should have respected Dad's request and stayed away. But I keep coming back to one thing. Dad had decades to tell the truth. And when his grandson became seriously ill and he was finally given a reason bigger than himself to stop hiding it, he still chose silence. So what do you think? Did we judge my father too harshly for something that began decades ago, or did 32 years of choosing secrecy make the consequences entirely his own?